what is one of the most contested turning points in American history? Many would point to the Civil War, but what if the man who defined that war never stood at its center? What if the election of 1860 unraveled differently? Not just a different president, but a different America entirely. Picture a nation still echoing with the Lincoln's warning. A house divided against itself cannot stand. In this version, the fractures of 1860 don't heal, they widen. Driven by a razor-thin election and a chaotic four-way split, the answer to who fills Lincoln's absence leads us straight to the heart of a political crisis, one that begins before a single shot is fired. In 1860, the American political system reached a breaking point. The presidential contest wasn't a typical two-man race, it was a four-way standoff, a reflection of a nation already split at the seams. Abraham Lincoln, the Republican, won the White House with less than 40% of the popular vote. A minority president for a country that had lost its ability to agree on anything. The Democratic Party, which had dominated for decades, shattered at its Charleston Convention, unable to reconcile the North and South's positions on slavery. They split into two factions, one backing Stephen A. Douglas, who championed letting territories vote on slavery themselves, popular sovereignty, and the other choosing John C. Breckinridge, who promised to defend slavery's expansion. Meanwhile, the Constitutional Union Party, led by John Bell, tried to ignore the crisis, focusing on preserving the Union above all else. The result was a map that looked less like a nation and more like a battleground. In the North, Lincoln and Douglas fought for every vote. In the South, Breckinridge and Bell divided the spoils. Lincoln's name didn't even appear on the ballots in 10 southern states. He was invisible there, a candidate who could only win by sweeping the North. And he did, just barely. But the victory was fragile. If any of the northern swing states, like New York, with its stockpile of electoral votes, had tipped against him, Lincoln would have fallen short of the majority needed in the Electoral College. The entire presidency would hang in the balance, not on the will of the people, but on the razor's edge of a few states' decisions. The Constitution had a mechanism for this kind of deadlock, the contingent election. If no candidate claimed an electoral majority, the House of Representatives would decide. But the rules changed dramatically inside those marble halls. Each of the 33 states got one vote, regardless of size or population. The bustling cities of New York and the empty plains of Oregon counted the same. 17 state delegations were needed to claim the presidency. In 1860, the Republicans controlled 16, just one short. The Democrats held 13, and the remaining 4 or 5 were deadlocked or controlled by minor parties, unable to offer a clear vote for anyone. Suddenly, the outcome was no longer about the popular vote or even the electoral count. It was about alliances, deals, and desperation. The North's numerical strength evaporated. The balance of power shifted to the states themselves, each with equal weight. The Republicans, despite their momentum, found themselves trapped. They couldn't reach the majority. The Democrats, fractured but stubborn, also faced a wall. The House chamber became a pressure cooker, with the fate of the nation suspended in the air. Picture Washington in the winter of 1860. The Capitol is tense, the air thick with rumors and anxiety. Southern delegations threaten secession if Lincoln prevails. Northern leaders warn of chaos if a pro-slavery candidate is installed. The center cannot hold. The usual machinery of government grinds to a halt as congressmen gather in private rooms, bargaining for the future. The stakes are existential: the survival of the Union, the fate of slavery. the very meaning of democracy. John C. Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, is too extreme for most Northern delegations. Choosing him would be a provocation, a signal that the South has seized control. Lincoln, on the other hand, is equally unpalatable to the South. His election by House vote would be seen as a Northern coup, a declaration that compromise is dead. The chamber looks for a middle path, a figure who can hold the center, if only for a moment. That man is Stephen A. Douglas, known as the Little Giant. Douglas spent his career arguing that the people of each territory should decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. His Kansas-Nebraska Act meant to bridge the divide, only deepened it. But he remains the only candidate with a plausible claim to neutrality. He's not beloved by either extreme, but he's not hated enough to start a war. At least not immediately. The scramble to install Douglas would be frantic. To win over wavering delegations, he would have to offer something to everyone. To the South, he'd promise to respect their institutions and let them decide their own fate. To the border states, he'd pledge stability and moderation. To the North, he'd sell himself as the only alternative to Breckinridge's extremism and the only hope for avoiding outright civil war. He would become the candidate of uneasy compromise, the man who keeps the country together by refusing to take a stand. But this compromise is an illusion. Douglas's popular sovereignty had already failed to resolve the core conflict. It would only delay the inevitable. Electing him would not heal the country. It would freeze the crisis in place, buying time while the underlying tensions festered. The House, desperate to avoid immediate disaster, would choose Douglas, not because he inspired confidence, but because he represented a temporary escape from the abyss. This outcome would not be a triumph for democracy. It would be a warning. The system, when pushed to its limits, produces not a leader of vision, but a manager of decline. Douglas, forced into the presidency by backroom deals and shifting alliances, would inherit a nation more fractured than ever. His administration would be marked by paralysis, endless negotiation, and the slow erosion of faith in the Union itself. The election that broke America would not end with a bang, but with a long, painful unraveling. The Union would stumble forward, its divisions deepening, its institutions hollowed out by compromise. The cause of abolition, the promise of a new political movement, would be left stranded, its momentum lost, its future uncertain. And in the shadow of this failed victory, a new question emerges. What becomes of a political party when its first great chance slips away? What happens to a movement built on hope and defiance when the system refuses to let it win? The story of the Republican Party in 1860 is a study in fragile momentum. 6 years earlier, it hadn't existed. Its birth was a direct reaction to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a law engineered by Stephen Douglas that cracked open the door for slavery's westward expansion and shattered the uneasy peace of the Missouri Compromise. That single act set off a chain reaction. Former Whigs, their own party dissolved by indecision, joined with anti-slavery Democrats and radical abolitionists. These were people who had spent years in political exile, suddenly drawn together by a single urgent purpose: stop the spread of slavery, and in doing so, preserve the Union itself. The Republican platform in 1860 was simple but explosive. No more expansion of slavery into the territories. Around that core, the IRAP policies meant to broaden their appeal: protective tariffs for northern manufacturers, promises of free land for settlers, and federal investment in infrastructure. But everyone knew what really held the party together. It was a coalition bound by a moral line in the sand, and that line ran straight through the heart of the country. A defeat in the House, however, is more than a lost election. It's a fracture that exposes every seam in the Republican coalition. The party's moderates, men like Abraham Lincoln and William Seward, had always tried to balance moral urgency with political calculation. They were willing to compromise, to move slowly, if it meant keeping the Union together. The Radicals, led by voices like Salmon P. Chase and Charles Sumner, had no patience for half measures. For them, containment was cowardice. Only immediate abolition would do. Without the unifying force of a presidential victory, these factions turn on each other. The Radicals blame the moderates for playing it safe, for focusing on continuing slavery rather than ending it outright. They say the loss is proof that compromise is a dead end. The moderates, in turn, accuse the Radicals of scaring off swing voters with their uncompromising rhetoric, making the party look like a band of extremists and handing the presidency to Douglas. The argument isn't just about tactics, it's about the party's soul. And in the aftermath of defeat, nobody's interested in reconciliation. This kind of infighting isn't theoretical. American history is littered with third parties that flared up and then vanished as quickly as they arrived. The Know-Nothings had ridden a wave of anti-immigration sentiment to brief national prominence, only to dissolve into irrelevance when their coalition collapsed over slavery. The Republican Party, now denied its breakthrough, starts to follow that same path. The tent that once seemed big enough for everyone shrinks rapidly. The party retreats to its new strongholds in New England and the upper Midwest, its national ambitions dashed. The consequences are immediate and personal. William Seward, once the odds-on favorite to lead the party and the country, finds himself a senator without a movement. His grand vision for America dissolves into a string of frustrated speeches, his influence fading with each passing session. Salmon P. Chase, who had built his career on morale, clarity, and anti-slavery conviction, sees his future narrow to the confines of state politics. The networks, the alliances, the dreams of a new political order all begin to unravel. Political parties in this era run on more than ideals, they run on money. In 1860, the Republican Party had convinced northern industrialists, bankers, and merchants to back them, promising policies that would favor economic growth in the North. A presidential victory was supposed to deliver returns on those investments. When that victory slips away, so does the money. Donors lose faith in a dividend-defeated party. The machinery that powered the Republican rise, newspapers, pamphlets, campaign offices, grinds to a halt as funds dry up. What's left is a skeleton crew of diehards and volunteers, a movement running on fumes. Momentum once lost, it's nearly impossible to regain. The Republican Party doesn't implode overnight. It fades gradually, becoming just another regional voice unable to mount a serious challenge on the national stage. Its platform, free soil, free labor, free men, loses its force. The phrase that once electrified crowds becomes an echo, a memory of moment that might have changed everything. This collapse has a ripple effect far beyond policies. The abolitionist movement, which had finally found a political home, is left adrift without the Republicans as a national force. The campaign to end slavery loses its most powerful weapon in Washington. The Democratic Party, still riven by its own divisions, but now unopposed, resumes its dominance. The issue of slavery, unresolved and festering, continues to poison the country's policies. the machinery of government returns to business as usual. But the underlying crisis only deepens. The fate of the Republican Party becomes a warning. Movements built on hope and morale, urgency can change the world. But only if they survive their first test. Without victory, without power, even the most outrageous cause can be pushed to the margins. The party that once promised to reshape America instead becomes a cautionary tale, a ghost in the political graveyard, remembered only by historians and those who still dream of what might have been. Yet the nation doesn't return to stability. The wound that brought the Republicans together in the first place remains open. The Democratic establishment, now unchecked, faces the same impossible questions about the future of slavery, the Union, and the meaning of freedom. The old order limps on, but the center is weaker than ever. The country is left searching for answers, with no clear voice to guide it. As the dust settles, the political stage is set for a new kind of uncertainty. The man now at the helm, Stephen Douglas, must try to govern a nation that has already began to come apart. The challenge he faces is not just about policy or compromise, it's about whether any leader in this moment can hold together a country that has lost its sense of direction. Stephen Douglas's promise was simple on its surface. Let the people decide. Popular sovereignty, his great invention, was supposed to drain the poison from America's politics by handing the question of slavery to the settlers themselves. It sounded democratic, pragmatic, almost noble, but it was a promise already broken by history. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, Douglas's signature achievement, had unleashed chaos instead of consensus. In the years since, the phrase "bleeding Kansas" had come to mean one thing, that when the stakes were existential, ballots turned into bullets and neighbors into enemies. This was a flawed tool Douglas brought to the presidency, convinced he could wield it to patch a nation already coming apart at the seams. March 4th, 1861. The Capitol dome is unfinished, scaffolding rising like the bones of a nation still under construction. Stephen A. Douglas stands before a divided crowd, hand on the Bible, inheriting a government in freefall. In the months since the election, while President Buchanan watched helplessly, the Union had begun to dissolve. South Carolina seceded first, then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed, each state peeling away with a mixture of defiance and dread. In Montgomery, a new Confederate government was already setting up shop. Douglas, the little giant, believed he could talk them back from the brink. He saw crisis as a negotiation, not a reckoning. Douglas's entire political life had been built on the idea that every conflict could be solved if everyone just sat down at the table. He was a master of compromise, a man who thrived in the smoke-filled rooms of Congress, hammering out deals that pleased no one but kept the wheels turning. But now, the wheels were coming off. The South no longer wanted a deal. For the leaders of secession, the time for compromise had ended the moment a president from outside their world took office. Douglas's faith in popular sovereignty, a policy that had already failed spectacularly in Kansas, offered nothing to men who saw their entire way of life under threat. For the Southern radicals, Douglas was not an ally. The Dred Scott decision handed down by the Supreme Court in 1857 had given them a legal argument. The federal government, they claimed, could not prevent them from taking enslaved people into any territory. Popular to sovereignty to them was an existential threat, a loophole Northerners could use to avoid slavery out of existence, one territory at a time. Douglas' offer of local choice was seen as a Trojan horse, a way to strangle slavery's expansion and eventually its survival. In the North, Douglas's promise was just as toxic, but for different reasons. Abolitionists and anti-slavery Republicans saw popular sovereignty as moral cowardice. To them, It was a way of pretending that the country could simply vote away its original sin, as if the fate of the millions could be settled by a show of hands. Douglas's refusal to take a stand, his insistence on process over principle, looked like a betrayal. The idea that the federal government could remain neutral on slavery, that it could leave the question to the shifting winds of local politics, was bad to everyone who believed in the promise of liberty. So Douglas entered office with no real base. The South viewed him as a threat, the North saw him as a sellout. His presidency began in a vacuum of trust, with every move scrutinized, every word parsed for signs of surrender or aggression. He faced a nation already divided into camps, each convinced that the other was about to destroy everything they held sacred. Desperate to find a way forward, Douglas would have turned to the last battered tools of compromise. The Crittenden Compromise, a package of constitutional amendments designed to appease the South, would have become his lifeline. Its core idea was simple: draw a new line across the continent, resurrecting the Missouri Compromise, and make slavery permanent and protected south of that line. It was a solution rooted in the past, an attempt to restore an old balance that no longer existed. But even this grand gesture was doomed. The South's new leaders were not interested in guarantees or lines on a map. They wanted independence, not reassurance. They were already building a new nation, one founded on the explicit protection of slavery and white supremacy. For them, Douglas's offer was too little too late. A sign of northern weakness, not good faith. Every compromise proposal only deepened their conviction that the Union was finished, that the time for negotiation had passed. Meanwhile, in the North, the idea of writing slavery's expansion into the Constitution was unthinkable. The Republican Party, even in defeat, could not accept a deal that betrayed everything it stood for. The abolitionist press would have erupted in outrage. Political leaders would have denounced Douglas as a man willing to sacrifice principle for peace. The Crittenden Compromise, like so many last-minute bargains before it, would have died in committee, a casualty of irreconcilable demands. Douglas tried to govern through persuasion and patience. His inaugural address would have been a dry recitation of constitutional arguments and legal precedents. No poetry, no moral clarity, just a plea for time and negotiation. He would have promised to enforce the laws, to respect property rights, to seek common ground. But the moment demanded more than words. The South saw his moderation as weakness. The North saw his refusal to act as betrayal. The border states, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, watched closely. These were the places where the fate of the Union would be decided. They needed signs of strength, of resolve. Instead, they saw a president caught between factions, paralyzed by the fear of provoking war, but unable to prevent it. Douglas's attempt to reassure both sides reassured no one. Federal authority began to dissolve, not with a dramatic confrontation, but through slow, quiet erosion. Laws went unenforced, federal property was abandoned or seized. The machinery of government sputtered as local loyalties replaced national ones. Douglas's presidency became a study in paralysis. Every effort to split the difference made things worse. His supporters dwindled, his critics multiplied. The crisis deepened not with the sudden violence of a cannon shot, but with a steady, relentless drift towards dissolution, where Lincoln would have drawn a clear line, defining the conflict as a test of democracy itself. Douglas offered only process and delay. The result was confusion, frustration, and a growing sense that the center could not hold. The promise of popular sovereignty, once hailed as a solution, now looked like a trap. It left Douglas without the authority to act decisively, without the moral foundation to rally the nation, and without the political support to enforce his will. He was a president in name, but not in power, a man watching the country slip through his fingers, unable to stop the unraveling. What followed was not a moment of reckoning, but a slow-motion collapse. the federal government faded from the scene, replaced by local militias, ad hoc committees, and rival governments. The Union did not break with a single dramatic act. It simply ceased to function, its authority dissolving in the face of competing loyalties and rising violence. And as the nation stumbled into this new reality, the question shifted. If there was no Fort Sumter, no clear line in the sand, how would the conflict begin? In the absence of a decisive stand, what shape would the coming struggle take? We remember the Civil War's beginning as a single unmistakable flashpoint. Fort Sumter, April 1861, the thunder of Confederate guns shattering the dawn, the Union flag under fire. That moment gave Lincoln everything he needed: a moral line, a villain, a call to arms. But in a world shaped by President Stephen A. Douglas, the story never finds its spark. There's no bombardment, no rallying cry, no sudden shift from argument to war. Instead, the crisis steeps across the map, slow and corrosive, never quite erupting, never quite ending. The uncivil war begins not with an explosion, but with a long, uncertain silence. Douglas, ever the compromiser, would have seen the federal garrisons in the South as tinderboxes, not symbols. He would have ordered the evacuation of places like Fort Sumter, lowering the flag in hopes of buying time and goodwill. He'd call it statesmanship, a gesture meant to bring the seceding states back to the table. But by removing the tripwire, Douglas erases the moment that, in our history, forced every American to choose a side. Instead of a nation at war, the United States becomes a nation in limbo. Without a formal declaration, the fight moves out of the spotlight and into the shadows. The real struggle ignites in the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, where the lines are blurred, and loyalty is a question that splits families. These states, vital for their geography and resources, become the crucible of the conflict. There's no clear front, no massed armies, just a patchwork of local militias, vigilante gangs, and partisan bands. Violence erupts in back roads and courthouse squares. In Missouri, old rivalries from bleeding Kansas come roaring back. German immigrants and pro-Union farmers arm themselves against secessionist Minutemen. Rail bridges burn in the night. Sheriffs pick sides and jails become fortresses. The war is everywhere and nowhere. Neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. In this world, the federal government is a ghost. Douglas, trapped by his own faith in negotiation, can't name the crisis for what it is. He refuses to call it rebellion, threatening the violence as a series of local disturbances, not a national emergency. His response is bureaucratic, not military. He sends federal marshals into chaos, issues proclamations begging for order, and convenes endless committees. In Washington, Congress debates while the country bleeds. Douglas's administration becomes a study in paralysis. Statements without action, law without hope, force without strategy. What's missing is the clarity that war can bring. Lincoln's Union had a purpose: preserve the nation, answer the gunfire at Sumter, restore the Constitution by force. Douglas's America has only one question. To a clerk in Boston or farmer in Ohio, the news from Missouri feels remote, tangled, and political. There's no sense of existential threat, no call that rings out across state lines. Why risk your life for a president who can't explain what's at stake? Why volunteer for a cause that feels like someone else's fight? The North, in its timeline, never finds its soul. There are no mass rallies, no surging lines of volunteers, no great speeches echoing across the fields. The abolitionist press shouts into the void, but the story never catches fire. The violence in the border states is relentless but fragmented. Skirmishes, assassinations, sabotage, and reprisals. Each act of brutality breeds another, but there's no single enemy to defeat, no capital to capture, no flag to reclaim. The federal government's absence turns every country into its own battlefield. Even courthouses impossible frontline. Meanwhile, the South consolidates without the threat of a Union invasion. The Confederate States of America has space to breathe. Their leaders build institutions, draft constitutions, and rise armies, not for desperate defense, but for the slow work of nation building. The border between North and South hardens, not through conquest, but through agitation. The rivers and railroads of Kentucky and Missouri become lines of smuggling and sabotage. The borderlines fill with refugees, spies, and opportunists. The violence is a constant, but it never resolves. It just becomes a way of life. Douglas tries to revive compromise, resurrecting proposals like the Crittenden Compromise, offering constitutional guarantees for slavery below a certain line. But the time for deals is over. Southern leaders see these gestures as weakness, not reconciliation. Their new government isn't bargaining for better teams, it's claiming its own destiny. Douglas's overtures fall flat, and each failure deepens the sense of drift. The North grows cynical, the South grows confident, and the center cannot hold. The media landscape reflects the confusion. Newspapers in New York print stories of atrocities in Kentucky, but with no clear narrative. Is this a rebellion, a crime wave, or a new kind of war? Editorials demand action, but Congress delivers only debate. The national conversation fractures, each region consumed by its own fears and rumors. The old idea of the Union, one nation indivisible, fades into abstraction, replaced by a patchwork of loyalties and private armies. What emerges is a conflict without boundaries or resolution. The uncivil war drags on. Year after year, a grinding, low-intensity insurgency. The violence never rises to the scale of a true civil war, but it never subsides. The United States becomes a country defined by its wounds, towns divided, economy shattered, families scattered. The border states, once the nation's hinge, become its open sore. For the South, the absence of a Northern crusade is a gift. The Confederacy has time to entrench its power, to build alliances, to imagine a future beyond mere survival. The longer the uncivil war grinds on, the more permanent the split becomes. The dream of reunion fades, and the old Union is no longer an idea to fight for, but a memory to mourn. And as the years pass, the world takes notice. The United States, once the rising force of the Western Hemisphere, now appears fractured and vulnerable. The vacuum left by a paralyzed government and a divided nation invites ambitions from beyond its borders. The struggle that began as an internal crisis begins to reshape the continent's balance of power, drawing new players into the game and setting the stage for ambitions far larger than anything the old Union ever imagined. The Confederacy's vision was never just about holding the line in defense. At its heart, and the movement for Southern independence was fueled by a hunger for empire, an empire built on cotton and on the backs of enslaved people. The blueprint for this new order was called the so-called Golden Circle, a plan to stretch the reach of slavery far beyond the borders of the 11 seceded states. Southern leaders pictured a future where their flag flew over Cuba, the Caribbean, and deep into Central America. In our timeline, the Union's relentless pressure crushed this fantasy before it could leave the drawing board. But in a fractured America, where the federal government hesitates and the North is paralyzed by indecision, the dream of the Golden Circle becomes something more than talk. It becomes policy. From the moment the Confederate States of America declared itself a nation, its leaders understood that survival depended on legitimacy. The world's greatest powers, Britain and France, held the keys. The South's diplomats worked every angle, but their real weapon wasn't rhetoric, it was cotton. The white fiber grown in endless rows from Texas to the Carolinas was the raw material of the Industrial Revolution. British mills in Manchester, French looms in Lyme. These engines of empire ran on southern cotton. Without it, factories fell silent and workers took to the streets. The Confederacy knew it, and so did every cabinet minister in London and Paris. In our history, the Union blockade slowly strangled the South's economy, forcing Europe to seek new sources of cotton in Egypt and India. But here, President Douglas avoids escalation. He refuses to order a blockade, hoping to keep the peace and buy time for negotiation. The result is a steady flow of cotton across the Atlantic. Ships sail unimpeded from New Orleans and Charleston, their holds packed tight with the harvest. European factories keep running. The threat of economic crisis in Britain and France never materializes. King Cotton diplomacy, a gamble in our world, becomes a devastatingly effective strategy in this one. Economic leverage quickly becomes political capital. In London, Parliament debates the American crisis, but the conversation is different. The anti-slavery movement is strong, but the reality of thousands of jobs on the line weighs heavier. Industrialists and merchants lobby hard for recognition of the Confederacy. The aristocracy, always wary of a strong, united America, sees a divided continent as a strategic boon. With the Union unable to project strength or unity, British leaders like Lord Palmerston see a clear path: recognize the Confederacy, secure the cotton supply, and weaken a rival. By 1862, after a string of Confederate successes in the chaotic border states, Britain makes its move. Diplomatic recognition is extended to the Confederate States of America. It's not a military alliance, at least not yet, but it's everything Richmond was hoping for. British banks open their vaults. Confederate diplomats sign contracts for rifles, artillery, and steamships. The South's credit, once shaky, suddenly looks solid. With London's blessing, France follows suit. Napoleon III, eager to expand his influence in the Americas, sees the Confederacy as a useful partner. His plans for intervention in Mexico, already underway in our history, now have a friendly neighbor to the north, not a hostile Union. Legitimacy changes everything. The Confederacy is no longer a rogue rebellion, it's a nation recognized by Europe's greatest powers, flush with loans and modern weaponry. The focus in Richmond shifts from defense to ambition. The Golden Circle, once a whispered hope among fire eaters, becomes an official project. The government funds private expeditions, filibusters, aimed at destabilizing and eventually annexing nearby territories. Cuba is the first target. For decades, Southern politicians had dreamed of bringing the island into the slave system. Now, with European backing, Confederate agents funnel money and arms to pro-slavery factions on the island. They sponsor uprisings, hoping to create chaos that will justify intervention. The Spanish colonial government, already stretched thin, struggles to maintain order. Confederate ships patrol the waters, sometimes openly, sometimes under the cover of private enterprise. The same playbook unfolds along the Rio Grande. Northern Mexico, plagued by instability and weak central authority, becomes a magnet for Confederate adventurers. Filibustering expeditions across the border, sometimes claiming to restore order, sometimes simply seizing land. The promise is always the same: new territory for cotton, new markets for slaves, new states to tip the balance of power even further towards Richmond. All the while, the United States government watches helplessly. President Douglas issues protests, but his words carry little weight. The Union, riven with internal conflict and lacking the means to enforce its will, can do nothing to stop the South's expansion. The Monroe Doctrine, once a warning to European empires to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, becomes an empty phrase. With no unified American military threat, Britain and France operate freely. Britain treats the Confederacy as a client state, ensuring a steady flow of cotton and keeping the United States divided. France pursues its ambitions in Mexico, installing a puppet emperor and carving out a sphere of influence with no fear of American intervention. The result is a new world order. The Confederacy, propped up by European capital and protected by British and French diplomacy, becomes an aggressive, outward-looking power. Its leaders see themselves as the vanguard of a new slaveholding civilization. The expansionists fear that once drove the United States westward now drives us southward and eastward. Every new territory is another link in the chain of cotton and slavery. The impact ripples outward. the United States, humbled and weakened, loses its standing as the continent's dominant power. Its economy stagnates and policies fracture further, and its leaders look on as the South and Europe redraw the map of the Americas. The dream of a hemisphere free from old world interference is gone. In its place is a patchwork of rival empires, each jockeying for advantage, each willing to use the tools of war and diplomacy to secure its interests. For the Confederacy, the gamble pays off. The empire of cotton becomes a reality, its foundations built on forced labor and foreign recognition. The price is paid by millions. Enslaved people in the fields, workers in the mills, and the citizens of a United States that can no longer shape its own destiny. But beneath the surface, something else is lost. The driving engine of American progress, the relentless push for innovation, the explosive growth of the industry, the sense of shared national purpose, never ignites. The South's triumph comes at the cost of the North's momentum. The continent settles into a tense, uneasy equilibrium, each side wary, each side waiting. The world watches, but the great transformation that once defined America's rise remains out of reach. In this alternate America, the furnace never ignites. The age of iron and rust isn't forged by fire, it's shaped by absence, by everything that doesn't happen. The Civil War in our world was a crucible that transformed the United States from a patchwork of farms and small towns into an industrial colossus. But without the war, the spark that set the machinery of progress roaring to life never arrives. Instead, the nation drifts, its promise of modernity left to gather dust. The factories of the North, which in our timeline become the arsenal of democracy, never receive their orders for millions of rifles, cannons, uniforms, and railcars. There's no urgent call from Washington, no bottomless government contracts to flood the workshops of New England and Pennsylvania with cash and demand. The partnership between federal power and private industry, so vital to the birth of the American Revolution, American industrial age, remains tentative and small scale. The gears of mass production turn, but slowly and always with hesitation. Companies expand in fits and starts, not in great leaps. The economic landscape is a patchwork of local industries, each growing at its own pace, none pulled together by the gravity of a national emergency. Railroads, too, missed their moment. In our history, the war made them essential. Armies had to be moved, supplies delivered, messages sent across vast distances in hours, not weeks. The Pacific Railway Act and the Homestead Act, both born of wartime necessity, become political afterthoughts in a country obsessed with holding itself together. The great iron ribbon that should have bound the continent remain unfinished. Their construction delayed by lack of funds, political will, and urgency. The West stays distant, less a partner in the national project and more of a collection of isolated outposts. The dream of a single unified market, goods flowing seamlessly from Chicago to San Francisco, remains just that, a dream. Innovation, that other children of conflict, loses its midwife. The Civil War's relentless demand for solutions, better rifles, more efficient supply chains, faster communication, created a golden age for American inventors and entrepreneurs. The system of interchangeable parts, perfected in the rush to arm the Union, becomes a curiosity, not a revolution. Medical advances spurred by battlefield necessity, new surgical techniques, better sanitation, organized field hospitals arrived decades late, if at all. The ironclad warships that changed the face of the naval warfare in the single afternoon at Hampton Roads remain blueprints and idle speculation. The national banking system born from the need to finance the war is still a patchwork of local banks and state currencies. Without crisis, the country muddles through, never forced to leap ahead. The titans of industry whose names would come to define the Gilded Age find themselves in a different world. Andrew Carnegie, in our timeline, built his fortune on the back of wartime steel contracts. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who made his railroads indispensable to the Union cause, never receives the same windfall. J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, these men still exist, but their rise is slower, their empires smaller, their ambitions dampened by the lack of explosive opportunity. The great fortunes that in our world reshaped American society and politics are replaced by more modest successes. The Gilded Age becomes a muted echo, an age of iron that never quite gleams. Even the fabric of daily life feels the difference. Cities grow, but not with the same feverish pace. There are no waves of rural migrants drawn by the promise of factory jobs and urban opportunity. The countryside remains crowded, the pull of the city weaker, the shift from rural to urban America delayed by a generation or more. The westward migration that should have filled the prairies and mountains with new towns and new dreams is a trickle, not a flood. The country's population is scattered, its economic energy dispersed, its sense of national purpose dulled. Without the war's unifying force, the United States remains a nation of regions, not a single people. The North and West, lacking the economic and infrastructural ties that the war would have forged, drift apart. The South, now a separate nation, entirely casts a long shadow. The border between the two Americas is more than a line on a map. It's a chasm that divides economies, societies, and futures. The promise of American manifest destiny, the belief that the continent would be united from sea to shining sea, dies quietly, replaced by a permanent sense of fragmentation. There is no post-war boom, no surge of confidence, no sense of destiny fulfilled. The United States limps towards the end of the century, its progress slow and uneven. The world's great powers, Britain, Germany, France, race ahead. Their factories roar, their cities swell, their armies modernize. America, once poised to join them at the forefront of history, watches from the sidelines. The opportunity to become the world's industrial powerhouse slips away, replaced by a quiet, persistent sense of what might have been. The financial system, too, bears the scars of inaction. In our world, the war forced the creation of a national currency and a unified banking system. In this timeline, bankers and merchants struggle with a jumble of state notes, local currencies, and unreliable credit. Investment is riskier, growth is slower, and the American economy remains vulnerable to panics and crashes that could have been avoided with stronger institutions. The tools needed to build a modern nation are present, but unused. By the late 1860s, the cracks in the American project are impossible to ignore. The country is poorer, less innovative, and less connected than it should have been. Its cities are smaller, its industries weaker, its influence on the world stage diminished. The story of American progress becomes a story of missed chances and the slow decay. The energy that should have helped leap into the modern age dispenses, leaving behind a nation still defined by its divisions. As the decade draws to a close, the United States stands at a crossroads, not of triumph, but of uncertainty. The great leap forward never materializes. Instead, the country settles into a pattern of quiet rivalry, uneasy coexistence, and lingering resentment. The border with the Confederacy hardens not just as a political boundary, but as a symbol of everything left unfinished. And so, as the calendar turns 1870, America finds itself changed, not by the fires of a war, but by the slow corrosion of missed opportunity. The nation is still searching for its identity, still haunted by the shadow of what it might have become. The next chapter isn't one of healing or reunion. It's a portrait of two Americas, staring at each other across a hostile divide, each shaped by the choices and the silences of the years just past. By 1870, the map of North America tells a story of fracture. Two nations, one calling itself the United States and the other calling it the Confederate States, stand on either side of a border that's more than a line. It's a barricade, a symbol, a daily reality. There's no post-war optimism, no grand experiment in national healing. Instead, the continent is locked in a tense, unresolved standoff that has become routine. This is the era of two Americas, each shaped by its own logic, each shadowed by the failures of the last decade. Start with the United States. The country that once imagined itself as a beacon for the world now feels diminished. both in territory and in spirit. It has lost much of its richest farmland and a large share of its population to the Confederacy. Washington, D.C. remains the capital, but the city's energy is muted, its halls echoing with the sound of arguments that never end. The government is weak, its legitimacy constantly in question. Presidents come and go, their names quickly forgotten, their policies more about managing decline than inspiring hope. Political life is a battleground of blame and regret. The Republican Party, which had once stood for a bold vision of free soil and free men, is now a regional voice, dismissed as a party that failed to stop the split. The Democrats control the majority of government, but their coalition is fractured, riven by old wounds and new grudges. Factionalism is the rule. The country's leaders argue endlessly over the fate of the Western territories. But the debate has shifted. It's not about slavery's expansion anymore. It's about survival, about holding on to what little remains and keeping the Confederacy from swallowing the rest. Economically, the United States limps forward. The industrial engine that in another timeline would have powered the North to global prominence is sputtering. Wartime demand never came. Railroads are built, but slowly, and the great wave of urbanization is a trickle. Factories operate below capacity. The Homestead Act is a shadow of what it could have been, as settlers hesitate to move west, uncertain which flag will claim their land in 5 years' time. The West is a chessboard, every territory a potential flashpoint, every negotiation a test of resolve. The American spirit, once defined by restless ambition, now feels trapped, boxed in by borders and by memory, by the weight of what might have been. Look south, and the view changes sharply. The Confederate States of America, forged in defiance, has become the world's most unapologetic slave society. Its leaders are drawn from the old planter, men who see themselves as the inheritors of a noble tradition. Their vision for the South is not just survival, but dominance, a society built on hierarchy, discipline, and the iron logic of the plantation. The Confederacy boasts a large professional army. Its borders is lined with forts, patrols, and checkpoints, an armed wall designed to keep its people in and its enemies out. The CSA has achieved what its founders dreamed: international recognition. British and French diplomats attend balls in Richmond, and Southern cotton flows freely to European mills. But the price is clear. The Confederacy is a client state, its economy tied to the whims of foreign markets. Industrial development is discouraged. The railroads and telegraphs serve the plantations, not the people. The cities are small, the ports busy, the countryside ruled by a handful of families who control everything from politics to the courts. Below them, an enormous population of enslaved people toils in the fields, their lives measured in profits and loss. Beneath the surface, the Confederacy is a fortress under siege. The threat of slave rebellion is constant. The army is as much as an internal police force as a defender of frontier. Laws are harsh, punishment swift, and surveillance is everywhere. The culture is one of pride and paranoia. Martial values, rigid etiquette, and a deep-seated fear of change. The South's leaders look north with contempt, seeing the United States as a failed experiment in mob rule. They see themselves as the true heirs of the American Revolution, defenders of a way of life that the rest of the world is too weak to understand. The border between these two nations is a study in tension. It runs from the Atlantic to the Western Plains, marked by forts, river patrols, and barbed wire. Soldiers on both sides watch each border through binoculars, waiting for the next incident. Crossing the border legally is rare and difficult. Smuggling and espionage are routine. The frontier towns are filled with rumors, spies, and the constant fear that today's skirmish could become tomorrow's war. Nowhere is this tension more explosive than in the struggle over human freedom. In this divided America, the escape of enslaved people from the Confederacy to the United States is not just a moral issue, it's an international crisis. The Underground Railroad has evolved into a vast clandestine network that stretches from the Deep South to safe houses in Ohio and Illinois. Every successful escape triggers a diplomatic standoff. Confederate agents cross the border in pursuit, sometimes with official sanction, sometimes in secret. When they're caught, both governments issue furious protests. The fate of each fugitive becomes a test of national will. A single gunshot on the wrong side of the river could ignite a border conflict. The border is not just a line, it's a fault, trembling with the pressure of unresolved history. This standoff shapes every aspect of life in both countries. In the United States, the presence of a slave-holding superpower to the South shapes policies, culture, and foreign policy. Anti-slavery activists are marginalized but persistent. Their cause now a matter of international law and border security. In the Confederacy, the constant threat of escape and insurrection justifies ever harsher laws and deeper surveillance. The two nations are locked in a Cold War, each side convinced that the other threatens its very existence. The competition spills into the West, where both nations fight for influence over new territories. Settlers, politicians, and soldiers are all drawn into a game of intrigue and intimidation. Each side funds local militias, sponsors newspapers, and tries to sway elections. The dream of manifest destiny, the old idea of a continent united by freedom and progress, is dead. In its place is a permanent rivalry, a struggle for advantage that never ends. Internationally, the consequences are profound. The Confederacy's alignment with Europe shifts the balance of power in the hemisphere. The United States, smaller and less confident, finds its influence shrinking. The two Americas become objects of foreign manipulation, their destinies shaped by as much by London and Paris as by their own capitals. The old idea of American exceptionalism is gone, replaced by a new reality, a continent divided, its promise unfulfilled. By 1870, there is no reconstruction, no attempt at reconciliation. The division is not temporary, it is the new normal. Each nation builds its identity in opposition to the other. The United States clings to the language of liberty, but struggles to live up to it. The Confederacy celebrates hierarchy and tradition, even as it feels the future. Both societies are haunted by what they have lost, and by what they might still lose. Yet beneath the surface, deeper questions linger. What does it mean to be a nation when the very idea of union has failed? How do you govern when every decision is shadowed by the threat of collapse? The answers to these questions will shape the next era, as both Americas search for stability in a world where the rules no longer apply. If you want to understand how American democracy lost its edge, you have to start with the office that was supposed to hold the nation together, the presidency, an institution that in our timeline became the engine of national power, never finds its moment in the sun. The faded blueprint of democracy is written in what the president cannot do, not what he can. Abraham Lincoln's real-world presidency was a break with everything that came before. He saw the Union as an idea worth saving at any cost. When the country fractured, he didn't wait for permission. He suspended habeas corpus, letting the army imprison suspected traitors without trial. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation as a war measure, an act of will, not of consensus. He created the first income tax, reaching directly into citizens' pockets to fund the fight. Each move was a gamble, a stretch of executive power that made his critics howl about tyranny. But Lincoln saw the presidency as the last firewall against collapse. He broke the rules, and in doing so, he rewrote them. In the world where Lincoln never rises, the presidency stays small. The man in the White House, Douglas or anyone like him, believes in process, not power. When faced with sabotage and sedation, he looks to the courts, not the Constitutional's war powers. He waits for Congress to act, even when Congress is paralyzed. The old legal guard, men like Chief Justice Taney, are ready to swat down any hint of executive overreach in our timeline. Simply ignore Taney's ruling, an ex parte Merriman, in this one, the president backs down. The machinery of government grinds to a halt, and the states watch Washington with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. The Emancipation Proclamation, that thunderbolt from the executive branch, never flashes across the sky. Douglas sees slavery as a political headache, not a moral crisis. He won't risk the border states, won't provoke the South, won't wield the presidency as a weapon of transformation. There's no war measure, no sweeping declaration of freedom. The power to change history sits unused, locked in the president's desk drawer. Congress split and bitter. Never acts, the presidency shrinks into a clerk's office, waiting for instructions that never come. The difference is more than style, it's a reversion to the founder's original sketch. The presidency is administrative, not visionary. The occupant is a caretaker, not a commander. The idea of a leader who can seize the moment, who can bend the nation's will in a crisis, fades into myth. The imperial presidency, so often feared in our world, is unimaginable here. The president is submerged to Congress, respected but powerless. The buck never really stops in the Oval Office. It gets passed and passed and passed again, until it's lost. This new order shapes the entire political ecosystem. The doctrine of states' rights, once a rallying cry and then a defeated idea, becomes a law of the land. The Civil War in our timeline was a brutal refutation of that philosophy. The victory of the Union proved that the federal government could and would enforce national unity. But in this alternate history, the lesson is the opposite. The federal government's failure is a warning, not a promise. States guard their autonomy with jealousy. Every federal action is met with suspicion. Every regulation is challenged. Every tax is a fight. The balance of power tips hard away from Washington, never to return. The consequences ripple outward. The federal government now sees as a meddler and a threat, loses the authority to tackle big problems. Picture a financial panic, a drought, a wave of immigration, any crisis that crosses state lines. The president can call for action, but he can't command it. There's no precedent for bold moves, no tradition for national mobilization. Each state acts in its own interest, and the federal response is a patchwork of half measures. The idea of a unified response of a president rallying the country is a fantasy. The real test comes with the crisis of the coming century. In our world, Franklin Roosevelt met the Great Depression with a flurry of executive orders and sweeping programs. The New Deal, a revolution in America, governs. In the faded Brooklyn, there's no such leap. The president lacks both the power and the example. He asks Congress for help, and Congress bickers. The states squabble over who should pay. Unemployment soars, banks fail, and the country drifts. There's no Social Security, no Work Progress Administration, no alphabet soup of agencies. The pain lasts longer, the recovery comes slower, if it comes at all. War. 2 reveals the cracks. In 1917, Woodrow Wilson led a reluctant nation into World War I, mobilizing industry, drafting millions, and projecting American power across the Atlantic. But in this timeline, the presidency is too weak to muster such force. The declaration of war, the draft, the nationalization of railroads, each step is a constitutional minefield. The president pleads, but the states hold the cards. Mobilization is slow, fragmented, and riddled with infighting. The United States, fractured and hesitant, is no one's arsenal of democracy. Even the idea of American democracy, its promise, its myth, begins to erode. Without a strong national government, the country can't guarantee rights, can't enforce equality, can't adapt to new challenges. The 14th Amendment in our world established birthright citizenship and equal protection. In the alternate timeline, such sweeping national committees are unthinkable. States decide who belongs and who doesn't. Civil rights becomes a local affair, subject to the whims of the states, legislatures, and local courts. The promise of a government of people, by the people, for the people, is narrowed fenced in by borders that should have faded, but instead grow sharper. The presidency, stripped of its muscle, becomes a symbol of missed opportunity. The office is long on ceremony but short on substance. The world looks to Washington and sees not a leader, but a committee chairman waiting for consensus that never comes. The blueprint for modern governance, drawn in crisis, tested in fire, remains unfinished. The American experiment limps forward, still nominally a democracy, but one that lacks the tools to meet the moment. This isn't just a matter of constitutional design, it's a question of national character. The absence of strong executive leadership seeps into the culture. Americans grow wary of ambition, suspicious of national projects, skeptical of anyone who claims to speak for the country as a whole. The dream of a shining city on a hill dims, replaced by a patchwork of local loyalties and private interests. The idea that America could act decisively, boldly, together becomes a story for another place, another people, another time. As the 20th century approaches, the faded blueprint leaves its mark everywhere. The United States, once posed to lead, finds itself unable to rise above its own divisions. The presidency, designed to be the engine of action in a crisis, is now a relic, respected, perhaps, but never feared, never admired. The world changes, but the American system stands still, trapped by the limits it never dared to break. And so, as the century turns, the question isn't just what America will do, but whether it can do anything at all. The nation faces a world growing more complex, more dangerous, and more interconnected. The blueprint is there, but the ink has faded. The time for boldness has passed, and the consequences of restraint are about to play out on a stage far larger than any one continent. By 1900, the world expects a giant. In our timeline, the United States fills that role. Industrial restlessness and newly ambitious. The country's factories churn out steel and locomotives. Its cities sprawl. Its population surges past 75 million. The Spanish-American War is a statement. The U.S. can topple an old empire in months and claim islands from the Caribbean to the Pacific. The Panama Canal cuts a new artery through the hemisphere, reshaping trade and military strategy. Roosevelt's Great White Fleet circles the globe, white hulls gleaming in foreign harbors, signaling that a new power has arrived and intends to stay. But all of this rests on one fact: a single, unified nation with the will and means to act. In the world shaped by a lost election in 1860, that foundation never exists. The American century never dawns. Instead, North America wakes each day to the reality of two rivals, neither strong enough to dominate, both too proud to yield. The United States and the Confederate States are locked in a permanent standoff. Their energy is spent not on expansion or innovation, but on maintaining the uneasy status quo among a tense border. The continent's promise is squandered by rivalry. The rivalry is more than political. It's economic, cultural, and military draining, resources and attention. Each nation eyes the other with suspicion, fortifying borders, building armies, and pouring money into surveillance and counterintelligence. The borderlands, Missouri, Kentucky, Texas, become zones of constant anxiety, where skirmishes flare and disappear and where the wounds of the past never close. Neither side can afford to look outward for long. There's always the fear that the other might seize an advantage while their gaze is elsewhere. This inward focus comes at a cost. The world's great powers, Britain, France, Germany, see opportunity. They send diplomats to Washington and Richmond, playing the rivals against each other. Trade deals are offered, then withdrawn. Military advisors arrive, promising new weapons and tactics in exchange for influence. European investors pour money into Southern cotton and Northern railroads, always with strings attached. The old Monroe Doctrine, once a warning to the world, becomes a hollow phrase. European powers no longer fear American intervention in the hemisphere. They expect to shape it. The Confederacy in particular becomes a willing client. Its economy depends on cotton exports to Britain and France, and its leaders are eager for recognition and protection. In return, the CSA opens its ports and markets, allowing European interests to take root. The dream of a golden circle, a slave empire stretching through the Caribbean and into Latin America, becomes policy backed by European capital and naval power. Confederate filibusters set their sights on Cuba and Mexico, knowing that London and Paris will look the other way or even offer quiet support. Meanwhile, the United States, diminished but not defeated, clings to its industrial base and its old ideals. It tries to build alliances with Britain and France, hoping shared values will outweigh the continent's divisions, but its influence is limited. The U.S. can offer loans and manufactured goods, but it cannot enforce its will. Its navy is respectable, but not dominant. Its diplomats are received politely, but never as equals. The vision of an America that shapes the world's future is replaced by the reality of a nation struggling to shape its own. As the 20th century unfolds, the pace of global exchange accelerates. Empires rise and fall, new technologies shrink distances and expand ambition, but the Americas remain fractured. The United States and the Confederacy are consumed by their own Cold War. Industrial growth is slow and uneven, disrupted by political instability and economic dependence on Europe. The great fortunes of the Gilded Age are smaller, their reach limited, the railroads are built, but the continent is not knit together. The West is a patchwork of contested territories and uncertain allegiances, a region where both nations compete for influence, but neither can secure it. The world's attention turns elsewhere. London, Berlin, and Paris set the agenda. Decisions about war and peace, trade, and technology are made in European capitals. The Americas are no longer the stage for bold experiments in democracy or industry. They are a backdrop, a source of raw materials and cheap labor, a place to be managed rather than feared. The leaders of the USA and CSA attend international conferences, but their voices are quiet. Their concerns are local, their ambitions constrained. The outbreak of World War I exposes the continent's weakness. In Europe, alliances snap into place, armies mobilize, the world braces for catastrophe. But in North America, the question is not when America will intervene, but how the fractured continent can be used. The United States, with its lingering ties to Britain and France, leans towards the Allies. The Confederacy, drawn by culture and commerce to Germany and Austria, Hungary, finds itself pulled in the opposite direction. Each side becomes a pawn in a larger game. European powers encourage sabotage, espionage, and proxy conflicts across the border. Factories are bombed, railroads sabotaged, and partisan groups armed. The war comes home, not as a crusade for democracy, but as another chapter in the continent's endless rivalry. The impact is profound. The United States never becomes the arsenal of democracy. Its factories are not mobilized on a massive scale. Its soldiers do not cross the Atlantic in great convoys. The war drags on, its outcome shaped by European sacrifice and strategy, not by American intervention. The CSA, for all martial pride, is a junior partner, useful but never decisive. The Americas remain on the sidelines, their potential unrealized. The consequences ripple far beyond the war. The 20th century's defining struggles against fascism, communism, and colonialism play out without a unified American presence. There is no Marshall Plan, no NATO, no voice calling for a new world order. The space race is a contest between Europe and Russia. The United States and the Confederacy watch from afar, divided and diminished. The idea of an American exceptionalism never takes root. The world's imagination turns elsewhere. The absence of a giant leaves a vacuum. European empires linger longer, their influence unchallenged in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The global balance of power remains centered on the old world, its rivalries and resentments shaping the fate of distant continents. The Americas are a cautionary tale, a land of promise undone by division. a region forever on the edge of greatness, but never able to seize it. And yet, history does not forget. The shadow of what might have been hangs over every decision, every missed opportunity. The world stage is set, but the great actor never appears. The lessons of this alternate century echo in the silence left behind, in the absence of a unifying force, in the quiet drift of nations that could have changed everything, if only they had found the will to do so. History doesn't echo with certainty, it reverberates with questions. The main topic here is the echo in the room. What lingers after a single decision, a single absence, changes everything? The alternate world we've just explored isn't just a curiosity, it's a warning, a reflection of how fragile the scaffolding of democracy truly is. The election of 1860, stripped of Lincoln, becomes less a crossroads and more a void, a silence where the future we know never finds its voice. We often read the past like a finished script, every event locked into place, every outcome inevitable, but the truth is more uncomfortable. The story of America was never predestined. The election that could have gone another way exposes just how thin the line was between union and dissolution, between progress and paralysis. A few thousand votes, a handful of choices made in back rooms and polling places could have swapped out the entire narrative reel. The echo left by a president who never was isn't just a missing chapter. It's a different book, entirely. One written in the shadows of doubt and hesitation. Trace the consequences. The rise of Stephen A. Douglas, the little giant of compromise, is no triumph. His victory is the product of a system already fraying, a reward for trying to keep peace by refusing to confront the storm. Douglas's presidency is defined not by boldness, but by a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. The South, hungry for separation, rejects his offers. The North, wary of conflict, settles for half measures. There's no clean break, no moment of reckoning. Instead, the country slides into a protracted, borderless conflict, a slow motion unraveling that never allows for healing. From this chaos, the Confederacy steps into the world stage. Its legitimacy isn't won on battlefields, but in diplomatic saloons in the counting houses of Europe. Cotton flows across the Atlantic, and with it, recognition and loans, and the quiet approval of foreign powers eager to keep America divided. The United States, denied the crucible of total war, never forges the industrial engine that would have powered its rise. The presidency, modeled on Douglas's cautious approach, remains a weak administrative post. States' rights become the dominant creed, and the center of gravity in American politics shift permanently away from Washington. The country grows poorer, its ambitions narrower, its sense of purpose diluted by endless negotiation. By the dawn of the 20th century, the echo in the room is deafening. The United States is no longer a rising power. It is a fractured, inward-looking nation, its destiny dictated by the ambitions of others. The continent is carved up, not just by geography, but by ideology and foreign influence. The world's great powers treat North America as a chessboard, moving pieces with impunity. The American experiment, once a beacon, becomes a cautionary tale. But the lesson isn't about the singular greatness of Abraham Lincoln. His story is extraordinary, but to focus only on the man is to miss the deeper, more unsettling truth. The real echo is the vulnerability of the very ideas he was forced to embody. Union, liberty, equality. In 1860, those weren't settled facts. They were radical, contested, and for many dangerous. The notion that the Union was perpetual was a minority view, one challenged by powerful voices who saw the nation as a fragile pact, easily broken. Universal liberty was not a consensus, even in the North. Many saw it as expendable if it meant avoiding war. Human equality for most Americans was a distant, even threatening ideal. These principles weren't stitched into the fabric of the country by tradition or habit. They were held together by the thinnest of threads, tested for the first time in a crisis that demanded more than just clever politics. In that moment, the ideas themselves were too weak to stand alone. They needed a champion, They needed a leader who recognized that the stakes were not just political, but existential. Abraham Lincoln's real genius was not in his rhetoric, but in his willingness to act when action meant risk. He was prepared to be hated, to be called a tyrant, to set aside cherished norms if that was what the moment required. When he suspended habeas corpus, he did so knowing it would be controversial, but believing that the preservation of the government outweighed temporary violations of legal tradition. When he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he reframed the war as a fight for something greater than territory, a fight for human dignity. He was not just managing a crisis, he was redefining what the country could be. The alternate timeline shaped by Douglass and his contemporaries is what happens when a nation responds to existential threat with ordinary politics. They were not villains, they were men of the moment, trained to believe that every crisis could be negotiated, every danger postponed. They offered compromise as a cure for conflict, hoping that the right words, the right deals would soothe the wounds tearing the country apart. But in doing so, they mistook the nature of the disease. The crisis was not about policy, it was about principle. They prescribed painkillers for a cancer that could only be cut out by force. Their path felt safer in the short term, but it mortgaged the future. The cost was not just delay, but decay. The echo in the room is the realization that democracy's survival depends on more than institutions and laws. Constitutions are only as strong as the leaders willing to defend them. Courts and elections are only as meaningful as the courage of those who uphold the spirit, not just their letter. The absence of Lincoln in 1860 is a case study in how quickly those supports can collapse. The nation faced with the abyss chose not to confront it, but to look away. The result was not compromise, but collapse. A slow erosion of ideals that left the country unrecognizable within a generation. Progress, as this alternate history makes clear, is never inevitable. It is always provisional, always a risk. It is earned, not given. The institutions Americans take for granted, strong executive leadership, national unity, the promise of equal rights, are not the default. They are the exception, the product of hard choices made at the edge of disaster. Without leaders willing to make those choices, the machinery of democracy grinds to a halt. The echo is not just a haunting absence, it is a warning. And as we look back at this pivotal moment, the question lingers: what if the next crisis finds us unprepared, unwilling to act, or too divided to choose? The echo in the room is not just about the past, it's a challenge for the present, a reminder that every generation stands on the same precipice, and that the future is shaped by those willing to confront the crisis, not just manage it. What comes next is not a return to certainty, but a reckoning with how close we always are to losing the things we think are permanent. When we close a book on this alternate America, what remains is not certainty, but the weight of choices made and unmade. The United States as we know it was shaped by a leader who refused to negotiate with catastrophe, who saw the nation's survival as a matter of principle, not just politics. Without that resolve, the very phrase United States becomes a contradiction, an idea left unfulfilled. Kelly Miller once wrote that it is enough to remember what Lincoln did, not what he might have done. In that spirit, consider what moments today might carry the same fragility. Share your thoughts below and subscribe for more alternate history.